Hi,
Hello.
everyone. Welcome to Hot Pot Talks. My name is David Ng, and I'm here with my dear friend and longtime creative partner, Jen Sunshine. You might know us as the co-founders of and co-artistic directors of Love Intersections, which is a media arts collective based in Vancouver that produces a documentary film about QT BIPOCs in our community. We're also members of the Vancouver Artists Labor Union Cooperative, also known as Value Co-op. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that Jen and I are beaming this live stream from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. We wanted to also highlight the work of Swan Vancouver, an organization that promotes the rights, health, and safety of immigrant women engaged in indoor sex work through frontline service and systemic advocacy. Last week's Hot Pot Talks with T-Base, we opened that conversation honoring the 8 people who were murdered at the massage parlor in Atlanta. And thinking about the reasons why we started Hot Pot Talks, out of this desire to talk about the themes that intersect with Chinatown, we thought it's important to recognize the intersection of sex work and working class that links to these dialogues about Chinatown's diaspora and labor. So if you have the means, please donate to Swan Vancouver. My colleague, Victoria, is going to drop the link in the comments now.
So Hot Pot Talks is a weekly series live streaming to YouTube and Facebook every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pacific time, where we have free-flowing conversations with artists, activists, chefs, performers, poets, community organizers, and tonight with a multi-hyphenate DJ, writer, academic, chef, about what it means to be an artist facing today's realities, what ethical responsibilities do we have as artists, what community organizing and art making looks like during quarantine, all the while sharing our favorite hot pot ingredients.
So why Hot Pot Talks? Why did we start Hot Pot Talks? For those who are tuning in for the first time, Value Co-op, we're located just 2 blocks from where I'm in my apartment, but a couple blocks down from here is the Lim Sai Hor Khao Mok Association building, a benevolent association building. And when we moved into Chinatown, recognizing the ways that artists have contributed to gentrification, and we had long conversations about how we could be proactive and generative about building reciprocal relationships in the community. And so through our community projects working group, we are doing a collaboration with the Lim Association, who I've known for many, many years, on this project called Engaging Chinatown, where we're going to be digitizing the archives originally we were going to turn it into a visual art exhibit, but COVID had other ideas. And so Hot Pot Talks is one of the ways that we've been reimagining how we can connect with people to issues related to Chinatown. I also wanted to thank everyone, Jen and I, thank everyone who bought a Chinatown Hot Pot pack. These were little hot pot packs. Each of the speakers or the panelists shared with us their favorite hot pot ingredient, and we put together these packages and sold them to raise funds for this project. Yeah, we had a lot of fun meeting all of you.
You still have a chance, though, to purchase our limited edition tote, because I think about these themes of nourishment and love all the time. Have you eaten today? Simply means I love you in BIPOC language, a simple question asked by so many of our parents, elders, and aunties everywhere, evoking a shared familial understanding of love and tenderness. These feelings of unspoken care inspire Hot Pot Talks, where culture and community nourish our bodies and for our hearts too. Before we welcome Tao, I want to thank our incredible team of practicum students who have made this Hot Pot series a possibility. Thank you, Lamia, Cameron, Ava, Yeska, and Victoria. Without further ado, I am thrilled to introduce PhDJ Tao Leigh Goffe, who is Assistant Professor of Literary Theory and Cultural History at Cornell University, who is also a writer, DJ, and an amazing chef. Tao is co-founder of the Dark Laboratory, an engine for the crossroads of Black and Indigenous ecologies. She is also the Executive Director of the Afro-Asia Group, an advisory organization with the mission of designing and theorizing African and Asian diasporas, futurity, solidarity, and infrastructure. I want to do a shout out to, of course, the Afro-Asia Group, who is also our co-sponsor of this Hot Pot Talk. Welcome to the table, Tao.
Hi.
Hey, Tao.
Hey.
How's it going?
So excited to be here on the shelf with you guys.
That's amazing. You look like you're in the pantry.
Yeah, so amazing. I think I have most of those sauces too in my pantry. Tao, I wanted
necessary.
Yeah. Tao, I wanted to start with how we met, and go back to where we met. This was in the summer of 2019 in Sensorium. We were at the Global Condition, which I guess you could describe as sort of like a gathering of academics, theorists, artists, curators. And I was just thinking about it the other day, because it was like 43 degrees centigrade. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. But it was really, really, really hot. And I remember, I just was curious about what memories you remember from that time. I'm gonna quickly screen share because I did find a picture.
Oh, I'm so excited to see the picture.
Oh no.
But yeah, I guess we should explain to people that Sensorium, my French is horrible, is in France.
Right.
And why I mention that is that I thought we were going to be in Paris. And this was not Paris at all.
No, it was not. So,
it was
this,
rustic,
I think,
let's say.
It was very rustic, and I think this used to be like an ex-convent or something.
Yes.
There
were so many haunted layers to the architecture.
Yeah,
you could feel it, you could hear it, you could smell, like the whole sensorium. Was activated by the hauntedness of this manor. I guess, what would you call it? It was also a hospital in like World War I or something like that, and ghosts.
I heard it was also like anyways, we don't have to go on about this, but one of my favorite memories was also we had this dance party in one of the wine cellars that you DJ'd. I'm curious, did you have any favorite memories from that time or memories from that time?
Yeah, I think the heat really just made it such a kind of heady space, as well as the intellectual, goings on in terms of Denise Ferreira da Silva, Alyosha Goldstein, and Mark Harris, who were kind of presiding and set us with this theme of the global condition. And I go back to that CFP time and again, and I feel like it was prescient because the world was on fire. Like you said, it was 43 degrees, or I deal in Fahrenheit, and I don't know, it's something like 100 or 98 degrees or something like that. And I think I didn't check the temperature translated into Fahrenheit, or the fact that this was not in Paris. In the French countryside, it took many buses and trains to get out there. But honestly, it was like such a beautiful electric experience that culminated in this dance party in this cave, this wine cellar cave. The Wi-Fi didn't work. There was no equipment, but me and another participant just decided to play music, and people were sweating, and it was fun.
I have a picture.
So
it was really good.
Makeshift dance floor.
Yeah, and Tao, I remember the first conversation that we had, actually, I think we were having lunch, and I immediately connected with you because you told me you were doing work around yellow peril. Yes, and I'm wearing my Yellow Peril Supports Black Power t-shirt today.
Oh, I need one of those, and also one of your tote bags.
Yes.
Was it Napa Cabinet on that?
It is.
Yes, of course.
David and I's favorite.
Yeah, and Jen and I had just finished our film Yellow Peril Queer Destiny, so I was like, oh my goodness, this is also a theme that we're exploring, and it's something obviously we've been thinking about over the past, oh my goodness, like I guess almost 2 years now, and thinking about sort of this theme of yellow peril and how it's kind of taken new forms actually over the past 2 years. I'm thinking, Jen, we had a visual art exhibit called based on the themes of the film, which one of the themes was queer Asian futurities, and it opened right at the beginning of the pandemic. I think it was February 1st. And even just by the time the exhibit closed in April, it seemed like the entire context of the show had kind of shifted as well. And so we adapted a lot of like our programming, also to respond to a lot of the stuff that was happening, particularly around like the anti-Asian racism.
Yeah.
I should also mention like the gallery is also in Chinatown, and there was quite a bit of vandalism that was happening in the neighborhood.
It
So I guess
really, well, it really put into context, or we started thinking really deeply around like the perilous nature of anti-Asian racism, and that like, in fact, the yellow peril never really, went away. In fact, it just like mutated like a virus, it kept mutating. It's in different iterations and forms. And we were experiencing kind of the brunt of that at the start of the pandemic last year. But it definitely made for a lot of things emerged, I think, as a result of that. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious, Tao, how that has sort of unfolded over the past 2 years for you and some of your work around yellow peril.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the term neo-yellow peril does a lot of work for me in this moment, because I sit with the fact of these Afro-Asian intimacies involving requisite tensions, and that there's a long history of Afro-Asian intimacies. So I think maybe at the time I probably was writing an essay, or maybe it was about to be published, on Dr. No, so the James Bond novel from 1958 that Ian Fleming wrote. And I think he is just the typical kind of supervillain embodiment of yellow peril that speaks to this kind of mutation that you described, Jen. And I think that's the perfect word. That it's always been with us. It's always extended across the hemisphere of the Americas. And it was inherited from Europe in ways that are very clear from the 19th century and moving on and on. So I really trace that yellow peril archive through the Caribbean, in particular, the US South, and its mutations there. And it's so pernicious, the ways in which people are saying things that are anti-Asian that I've heard before. And I've heard them in the archives, in the colonial archive. So for me, as a student of history, as a cultural historian, I'm not surprised by this anti-Asian violence, resurging, because it speaks to what I can see in terms of the mutilation, the violence in places like Peru and the Chinese community there from the 1800s, in Jamaica, in Suriname. I mean, across the hemisphere, in almost in every single country, there's a way in which the nation is formed against this yellow peril idea that the Chinese must go home, that the Chinese is this figure that is unassimilable. So I really just sit with the ways in which, how do we understand the exclusion of Blackness as well in conversation with Asianness, and specifically Chineseness, and whoever is assumed to be Chinese and who is excluded from the nation.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, last week we also talked about, we had a conversation, we opened talking about the Atlanta shootings too. And we were talking about also the specificity of that violence as well, and the intersections of sex work and the working class also, that also sometimes, like, we were sort of teasing out how it actually kind of is getting subsumed under this umbrella of anti-Asian racism, when there's also a very specificity of that type of violence. And we were thinking about that too, in terms of also Chinatowns being historically a space for the working class too, right? And thinking about like, the intersections of class that often get erased from some of the conversations that we're having right now as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, let's say, being an Afro-Asian person in this moment, because it's just not lost on me that, it took what our former, in the United States, president called a Chinese virus, that it took a Chinese virus for Black lives to matter on a global scale, for people to reckon with that. Black lives have always mattered, but I think there's something about this kind of convergence that is really, really scary, and it's something that is really dear to my identity, but also the histories that I've been studying. So those histories necessarily have to do with the very people that you just described, David, in terms of those who have been most vulnerable, those who have been, let's say, undocumented, those who have been working class people, right?
Mm-hmm.
The specter of the sex worker and of the Chinese woman, in fact, is what the United States is formed against. So even before the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, we have to look to the Page Act of 1875 and the ways in which the Chinese woman was always seen and imagined as this lewd figure. And that's like quoting from US legislation and policy, and that we have to keep her out of the nation. And the reason why is because of the gene pool of the nation.
Right.
So it's very clearly racist, but also about gender and sexuality in a way that I think gets lost. And also a class politics, because just as you're seeing this figure of the Chinese woman be excluded under the Page Act in 1875, you also see the quote unquote coolie being excluded. And we see that in the US in the Anti-Coolie Act of 1862 that Abraham Lincoln passed. But we have a different situation taking place in the Caribbean, where my research focuses. And obviously there are different contexts across the hemisphere as far as like the figure of the Chinese. And yeah, I feel that we're in this moment again where you have Joe Biden talking about what it means to be American, and that anti-Asian hate and violence is un-American. But it's hard for me to sit with that. I know that his intention is for these crimes not to happen, but it's so haunting that he made that speech, and then those shootings, the horrible, horrific events in Atlanta took place.
Right.
And we knew who the shooter was going to be in terms of the demographics, and the ways in which people try to explain away whatever his motives were are just unconvincing if you have studied history and understand, you know, what it means to be American as a very violent kind of inauguration or induction.
Now, Tao, you mentioned a little bit about your research in the Caribbean. I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit, because I have so many nerdy questions specific to some music-related questions for you. But maybe just for our audiences that are not aware of your research and background, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, and I have a picture so in the slideshow that I prepared in the second slide, because the Sensorium is so key to the work that I do. There, of course, is so much suffering and violence in terms of Black history, Asian histories, but I think it's also important for us to focus on, you know, joy in the senses that suffering doesn't define our experiences. Yes, there is a history of violence, imperialism, but we've also got a history that we can taste in the foods that we continue to cook, and also in the photographs that we, you know, that we collect in family albums. So there's this photo of my grandfather. It's a passport photo. Maybe I can pull it up on my screen. Let's see. But I think it's important because it sort of gives us a way to understand, okay, let's see, the history of the Chinese in Jamaica. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
So on the right, there he is with this canceled stamp across his face. And this is from 1934. So I really just think about the question of Chinese exclusion through him, you know, being born in Jamaica to a Chinese father and a Jamaican mother, a Black Jamaican mother. And the fact that at this moment, when this photograph was taken, he was sent to China, well, to Hong Kong, in fact, at that point, to be raised by his Chinese stepmother. So on the right, or on the left, sorry, we have a photograph of my grandfather's father, so my great-grandfather, and he was a migrant. So he migrated to Jamaica in the 1920s and had many children with many different Black women. And he sent a lot of them to Hong Kong to be raised. So they could be acculturated within Chinese tradition, language, and then sent for them to come back to Jamaica to run the family business.
Why do you think that that is? It seems like it's a pattern. for many Afro-Chinese families to kind of send them back to somewhere in China and then send them back to kind of take over the family business again?
So I think, I mean, the reason is commercial in that I guess there are many ways to show love, but one of them for this generation was to sort of send these children away. And in that photograph, I can just see a kind of way in which I can feel for my grandfather and what he couldn't tell me about his boyhood and the kind of Black boyhood in Hong Kong in the 1930s and what that must have been like. Yeah. But yeah, he was being trained to learn Cantonese, to learn Hakka, to become Chinese, essentially, in order to come back to Jamaica to be able to run the family business, which I think at that point was a soda factory. So there are many ways of Chinese migration across the Caribbean. The first of which that we should discuss is indenture, or what I call racial indenture. And that's the way in which this figure that I talked about of the coolie is actually really significant as a specter, but also as a replacement for enslaved Africans. So in this moment of abolition, we get various European nations saying, okay, we're going to replace Black people on the plantation doing agricultural work with the Chinese. Then later they say we're going to replace them with Indians. But in this moment in the 1800s, across the Caribbean, Asian becomes a kind of category for a replacement worker on the plantation. So that's the first wave of Chinese migration to the Caribbean. The second wave, of which my grandfather and great-grandfather were a part of in the 1920s, was of shopkeepers. So yeah, there's a very important difference in terms of labor and in terms of consent, to put it plainly. But yeah, I think I've kind of inherited that photograph that my mother just found in her mother's basement in Queens in New York. And I've just had to sit with it since my grandfather died many years ago to just try to imagine what his life was like and why he would never tell us about it. Because it was almost as if like English was a second language for him and he just didn't feel comfortable speaking with us about much of anything. But I guess in my studies, I've kind of learned to sit with what he didn't tell us and like what he couldn't tell us about that trauma of the 1930s living in Hong Kong, considering Japanese invasions and World War II. So there's a lot of family history to sit with.
I want to say just that when we did our pre-interview with you initially, one of the things that I learned recently, because I'm also half Hakka, is that I didn't know that the majority of Chinese people in Jamaica are Hakka. And it made so much sense because, you know, because Hakka people are nomadic, and that you see them in Southeast Asia, you see them in East Asia, all over the world, really. But I was born in Taiwan, and so I grew up with understanding the Hakka culture that was part of Taiwanese Hakka culture. And so, you know, when I learned that the Hakkas were kind of just nomadic because they're nomadic, so they traveled all over, that many settled in Jamaica as well, it just blew my mind. It's so cool.
Yeah, if you ever visit, you'll see it's very Hakka in affect. The vast majority of people are Hakka, as opposed to other places like Trinidad, where there's more like Cantonese, Punti, or in Guyana, it's very different. But Jamaica is like Hakka all the way, and very, very proud of that.
Yeah. Can you tell me more about that? Because I'm not Hakka. What are the characteristics, I guess, if you want to say, of that and how does that show up in Jamaica? I'm curious.
Well, I guess what's behind me, shopkeeping. Very important. So maybe their love language is the family business and shopping and this kind of like commercial sensibility. But I try to push against that because I think it's a very kind of like meritocracy of like, oh, it's in the blood to be good at business. And I think rather it's interesting to think about centuries of Hakka history and their nomadic migration across China and the kind of myth of what it means to be Hakka. But really as a way to trouble this category of Chinese, because I mean, Chinese people, you know, when they leave China is when they become Chinese. They're not thinking about being Chinese living in China, and certainly not in the 1800s or early 1900s was there this like fixed idea of what Chinese means. So I think it's just interesting that the Hakka become Chinese in Jamaica because there is a Black majority. So it's always been around over 90% African people who are Black. So in that context, with no other people from China, they become Chinese. Whereas if they went back to China, they would be part of this minority group, which the Hakka are, and have been very migratory. And it literally translates Hakka to guest dweller.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting how that actually used to be a slur, the term for it, but it eventually became descriptive as like the name for us. But it's very telling, you know, when we have these debates about indigeneity, and I thought your land acknowledgement was really important, but it kind of makes me think of the question of who is a settler and not, and the ways in which the Hakka have always been seen over centuries as a settler people, even though they've been in that region of South China for centuries. So my family, I was able to find my ancestral home, or where my grandfather grew up in Hong Kong, but just across the border is actually our ancestral village in Shenzhen. So there's many layers of migration and interactions with a kind of Chinese colonialism, but also British colonialism that needs to be unpacked.
Cool. I want to ask, poke into that, but I wanted to get into sort of how you've been thinking about these things through food. I went to I think it was the Chop Suey Supper Club at the Museum of Food and Drink, which I loved so much. I actually have a picture I want to show. So it was really cool. You did a talk, and then we actually cooked Chop Suey after.
That was so much fun. I'm so glad you tuned in.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. People were very amazed that I cooked it very quickly, but I prepped all my food beforehand.
If you prep it, then it goes so quickly. And the velveting was really fun to try out, right? What kind of protein did you use?
Sorry?
What kind of protein did you end up using?
Whatever you suggested. I think I did chicken and scallop.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's just a whole gastronomy of Chinese cooking. And there's a very specific style of Hakka cooking that you will find in Jamaica. So I was inspired to think about chop suey as a metaphor for the Afro-Chinese woman, this figure that I've seen in the colonial archive. And to think about this kind of like search for authenticity that a lot of people are involved in when they're talking about what is real Chinese food. But, you know, if they're going to eat Hakka food, they're not going to be satisfied because, you know, it's like boiled chicken. It's like flavors that it's not hot pot or like Sichuanese food. It's very, I feel like, understated and has its own flavor palette that is obviously part of South China, but very distinct and different. Do you know what I mean, Jen? Or have you?
Yeah, I got in trouble once because I called it bland, and
that's what people say. Understated.
So the other word, the euphemism, is understated. But I just was not used to that type of. And I think it goes to show like there are nuances when you're looking for the nuances. So you have to pay attention to the different flavors and the profiles. But at first taste and at first glance, it's not anything as overpowering as like other Taiwanese cuisines that I grew up with, or like other Chinese cuisines that are very, very like flavorful and spicy and
right.
Well, I was curious. So I was just curious, because one of the things that I remember from that talk too was that you were talking about like chop suey. Chop suey is a metaphor for entangled histories, but also thinking about like experimenting with different foods and flavors, whatever's in abundance. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit more about that. And I'm also curious because I know that you put together a recipe for that talk called a Jamaican chop suey, and you were I think it had allspice in the sauce as well. So I'm curious. Yeah. This is a more lighter question. Just I'm curious because you've also started. You're doing a lot of cooking and experimenting with different flavors. Have there been any sort of amazing flavor combinations that have come up? Have there been terrible ones that you've been experimenting with?
Well, yeah, I think the recipe that I wrote, I called it a decolonial recipe because I was just playing around with flavors. So it was not Hakka, but it was inspired by my cousin, Justin Lowe, who asked his dad, and they live in Jamaica, for his dad's recipe. So Chris Lowe is the inspiration in Jamaica for that recipe. But yeah, I think that one thing that I could say is very Caribbean Chinese is having like soy sauce with Scotch bonnet peppers kind of minced up. Oh. And I've seen that across the Caribbean and it's so good. Just as like a dipping sauce. Cool. It's so spicy, but it really, really works. Yeah, and I think specificity is important in terms of the Chinese who migrated to the Caribbean. So many are coming from Guangzhou, and it's Cantonese food that you're finding. It's oyster sauce. This is the flavor palette, which is about a kind of plenty. So I've just been experimenting. I only started cooking a year ago, since the pandemic, but it's been a really restorative practice where I'm breaking all the rules and just also thinking about the fact that I'm a DJ and a professor and trying to kind of understand something about recipes as being analogous to mixtapes, as being analogous to a syllabus, and that each kind of forms a love letter and intention that you have for another. So like that was an intention that I had for you, David, to read that recipe and to see the magic of putting these ingredients together. And there's so many ingredients, but I think it's like you learn something through cooking the chop suey. And I had never actually cooked it before, but you kind of learn about the abundance, the resource, the ways in which these Chinese migrants were feeding themselves, feeding the nation, and doing it in a very economical way. And it was so tasty.
Yeah.
Important.
Sorry, go ahead, Jen. Sorry.
I was going to switch gears because Tao mentioned being a DJ, and I really wanted to ask the super nerdy question, but also kind of like place myself in relation to my participation and love of like underground culture and like dance culture ultimately, and that because I'm a facilitator by trade, is what I've noticed was to be able to use facilitation as like as a practice for when I am observing how DJs facilitate in front of with this audience, on the dance floor, and how the facilitator or the DJ is like interacting with this audience by reading in and tuning into, the energies of the room, and also like figuring out, where the sound would hit parts of their body and make them move in certain ways. Like I just started to find those like points of connection between facilitation and DJing. And so I'm very, very compelled by this idea of this like mixtape that you've conceptualized. But I also wanted to really ask this super nerdy question because I became super obsessed with your paper, Bigger Than Sound.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So in this paper, you write about two institutions in Jamaica. And so one being the sound system and then the other being the Chinese shop. So I love how you wrote about the forging of an infrastructure of Afro-Chinese intimacies vis-a-vis like the sound system and the Chinese shops, as a space for, not just everyday transactions and interactions, but also like for you write for a leisure of dance, community, and listening, and that like the sound or the sound system is and you write, is a technological symbiosis of people, just as the shop is. And so I loved that. I love how you phrased that. So I think what I'm curious about for people who are tuning in, who might be ignorant on the subject matter, I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the role of Chinese Jamaicans in like the early formations of sound system culture and reggae music.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for reading that essay. It just came out in December, and it's been a culmination of, I would say, like a decade of work.
Yeah. So
I'm glad to put it to the page, but also that it draws from the book that I'm writing called Black Capital, Chinese Debt. So the key is in debt, but the key is also in the Hakka again, and the fact that they have historically been an agricultural people. And that was significant when we consider the institution of racial indenture, and that they were, in many cases, forced to come to the Caribbean to labor and toil away on these plantations. So the agricultural nature of the work that they were used to withstanding meshed really well with an island like Jamaica that is actually very mountainous. So the Hakka were unafraid to go and settle in many different villages across the country. And it was common, and there's a map that I have in the article that shows where these Chinese shops were across the island. So in a way, and this is what I'm kind of arguing in the paper, I'm not interested in race as a kind of biological idea or fact, but rather Chineseness comes to signify to me a kind of network, a commercial network that is about diasporic capital, and importantly, extra-colonial capital, in that these interactions are between Black people and between Chinese people and people who are Afro-Chinese. It really had nothing to do with the British and the colonial government, what was taking place in terms of the dance hall, in terms of reggae forming as a music. So there's something really beautiful to me about that. And I mean, I don't want to romanticize the relations between Black and Chinese people, because when I say intimacies, I do mean that it's requisite with tensions, with violence. You actually get many people of Caribbean Chinese descent exiting the Caribbean in the 1960s and 70s because of these commercial reasons, because there were many nations that were moving towards a kind of democratic socialism. And these Chinese shopkeepers wanted to seek futures elsewhere because of their business interests. So we see instances of anti-Asian violence and a lot of vandalizing and violence against the shops. And a lot of those people actually went to Toronto, also to Miami. But I would say that Toronto is the capital of Jamaican Chinese in the world. So it's a really important place for me in terms of research, because it's such a Caribbean city, it's such an Asian city, and all the pluralities of both of those identities and everything in between. So for me, it's about the fact that Toronto is also a city of dance culture, of these different forms in which people are coming together for a kind of co-production. And is it messy? Yes. Is there anti-Black racism amongst Asian communities? Yes. But at the same time, something beautiful is really created. And what you're talking about is this like facilitation. And I do think my work as a DJ is about understanding how there can be different elements coming together, say in a mixtape, which is an argument for trying to think about what is different and what is the same, and how we can dance on the same dance floor to different genres of music.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Tao, in our original first conversation that we had, we also talked about benevolent associations. And so originally we were gonna, as I mentioned earlier, we were gonna stream from our studio, but unfortunately we're in production right now. But I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about benevolent associations. Jen and I are working, as we talked about, are working closely with the LIM Association, and we had this in many conversations that we've had. the association has conveyed to us like a desire for people to be in, like, to come and learn about the history of the building, and so part of some of the work that we're hoping to do is to sort of be a conduit, if you will, between, as artists, to sort of be that interface for folks to connect with the community. I wanted to pull up a picture of our.
We have so many pictures.
Also, I'm just so excited to think about historic Vancouver, Chinatown, and like what I've studied about it, and I hope I get to visit one day.
Yeah.
Oh.
So they just renovated the facade. So they restored the original facade. It didn't look like that about 3 years ago. And they've done this beautiful, very expensive restoration, thanks to the city of Vancouver for this grant as well. And one of the things that we've been thinking about too is like the architecture, and I'm curious about your experiences with the benevolent associations that you've encountered. And one of the reasons why we wanted to shoot in that building is when you look at the architecture of the building, you can see so much of like the history of, well, the racial history of Vancouver there. Like, for example, the construction of it, they because of regulations around what Chinese people could build, they sort of built these split levels so that they could get around some of the regulations. And I wish I had a picture of this too, but they're on the side of the building. So Chinese people the building that we're in is right on the border of where Chinese people were not allowed to build. And so when they wanted to expand, they just sort of extended the back. And so the building, and you can literally see the divide of the building. So you can sort of, the building is literally marked with that sort of history.
Wow.
And like I recently found out that Dr. Sun Yat-sen used to do his like sermons in the alley there too, behind our studio. Yeah, so I'm curious about what had been when we chatted, you were telling us about, I think, benevolent associations in New York, in Kingston. I'm curious to hear your experience.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I have the chills right now just because we hadn't talked about this, but so I'm teaching an architecture class right now at Cornell, and I've just been thinking about haunted architectures and possibly like a way to DJ that. So my students and I are making a sound sculpture that will debut at the end of the semester to think through these questions of Black and Indigenous histories. But how, like, seeing that image and the way you describe the architecture of that benevolent association, it's almost exactly like the one in Kingston.
Really?
And I'm just so, because I was thinking about including a photograph to share with both of you, but like, it doesn't look like a pagoda. You know, it doesn't look like this kind of Orientalist design that like Westerners imagine. It is just this like tall building. It does have this split level design inside. I was lucky enough, because of the Chinese Benevolent Association in Jamaica, to be able to get a tour of the original building, which is in the old Chinatown of Kingston, that no longer exists, actually. And the Chinese are no longer a category on the census of Jamaica because the numbers are so small. So it's just interesting to think about a former Chinatown in Kingston, and that the architecture is the same, but also this was a space of worship and a space of shelter for people who would arrive at the harbor in Kingston. And these men, you know, didn't know anyone or have anywhere to go. So literally, like on the second level, it's a kind of open plan. People would just sleep there. So in the 1800s, late 1800s, it actually was the first stop for migrants who were arriving. And that's where they would set them up in terms of maybe starting a shop elsewhere in the country in this whole network. But it just reminds me of the architecture of Chinatowns being one of enclosure due to this kind of racism that this Chinese quarter forms, right, spatially, and that they're often near the harbor, right? In New York City, where I live as well, that's the case. And really this concept of racial contagion, racial enclosure is one that I've been using to think through the pandemic and what's taking place, because it is about these kind of violent enclosures regarding race and just a whole history of segregation. And yet the Benevolent Association is part of this network. It is a resource. It is a space for people to turn to, right? Amid anti-Asian violence, to be able to have a community center that really arranges life. And as I've thought about the horrible, killings in Atlanta, I've just also been reminded about the kinds of ways in which Chinese communities across the world have always had these centers for that very reason, for that refuge, in order to protect ourselves and to have that infrastructure, because the state simply will not provide it. So it's just really beautiful to see that, that architecture and image.
Yeah. We're doing this, Jen and I are doing this project we're really excited about. There's a calendar called the Mao calendar. I forget what MAU stands for, but we've been invited, and it features a lot of stories of the neighborhood, and an amazing. So this Benevolent Association is one of just a handful that was built by the Chinese Empire Reform Society. So I guess they were trying to reform the monarchy. And legend has it that they're under, I think each of these buildings, there's a time capsule and some gold coins. And it's funny, the elders are often joking, whenever I get a grant or something, or when something good happens, they're like, because we're in the building, they're like, oh, it's because of that time capsule and those gold coins. So we're designing an entry for this calendar that's going to sort of feature this legend.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait to see it. The key there is cosmology. I mean, my book is really about African and Chinese cosmology, and in the old Benevolent Association building, because there's another one that's newer. In the old one, it was also a temple. There, you'll find different objects of divination. You'll find different statues of various gods that were specific to these men from the 1800s. And there's a kind of ancestor worship that is really important in terms of a kind of genealogy. So that's really fascinating to hear these connections, whether Hakka or not. Chinese diaspora.
I'm curious, is the role of the Benevolent Association, the history of the role of the Benevolent Association in Jamaica, is it, I mean, from what I understand in Vancouver, a lot of the role was there were family clan associations that brought over indentured laborers to work on the railroad. And it was also, again, a point of connection, and then it evolved into a point of connection for new immigrants that came. Is that a similar history?
Yeah, very similar. I think the one in Jamaica forms in the 1890s, I believe. Once, so the first Chinese arrived in Jamaica in 1854 as indentured laborers. And it's interesting that it takes until that period for them to be able to have the money to buy this building and to be recognized by the state in this way. So it's just an incredible resource and kind of history. But I guess most recently when I went to Jamaica in 2017, it happened to be Lunar New Year. So I was able to see a kind of Chinese New Year celebration there. And there was clearly a kind of way in which the elders lamented that, people younger than us, Gen Z, I don't know what we want to call them, but are just not interested in the CBA.
Right.
It's the same here too.
Figure out what is going to be next.
Yeah.
Tao,
the next president.
Yeah. Tao, you wanted to share a video? Can I play that?
I think this video will give you all a taste of what Jamaican Chinese New Year is like in Kingston.
Cool.
At the CBA, Chinese Benevolent Association. little taste there. It was so meaningful to that my trip happened to coincide with that garden party, and to be able to see the lion dance. And then there was the whole kind of Chinese acrobatics act that was done by some young people, as well as the singing of, I think, Chinese national anthem and then Jamaican national anthem by very young children and like in Mandarin, which it was so adorable. Yeah, and just also interesting, like the racial politics of who you're seeing participate. Because as much as the Chinese Benevolent Association was a space of refuge and resource, it also was a space of racial policing. So they would only let people of a certain fraction of Chinese blood or heritage into the association. So whether I would be allowed to be a part of it historically, I don't actually know. And I think it would be worth looking into those bylaws. They are far more inclusive today, but is also the kind of space where it's a question, like, what if your mother is not Chinese? Does she get to come to Gasan, like ancestor worship at this Chinese cemetery? Right. Would she get to serve on the board or be at events? So it's, as much as it's a really, wonderful space, it's also a lot of tension inside that kind of infrastructure of deciding who is Chinese and who is not.
Well, it reminds me of also like I'm thinking about lion dancers now, and we have a friend who is a lion dancer, Dora, and they were also describing also some of the gendered politics in Chinatown and also in the benevolent associations, because they don't some of the studios don't teach women or women assigned at birth lion dance, and so Dora's been doing some. They've been teaching lion dance to everyone of all ages,
all body types, all ages, all genders.
Right.
Yeah.
I thought I might actually, just because I have the clip showing up, and it's a piece that Dora opened our last exhibit, and it references yellow peril. So I'm just gonna quickly play it.
Wow. And even just hearing, like, as a DJ, thinking about the kind of sensorial, like the music and hearing that echo is so interesting.
Yeah, cool.
Like in terms of who gets excluded. And also, like, people noted, I don't know if they just said it because of the context being Jamaican, but they're like, that lion is definitely twerking. That's a Jamaican Chinese guy. And I don't know. I feel like the moves are kind of similar, or maybe each lion is different in how they dance, but I like the idea of the twerking lion dance. It seems fortuitous to me.
Tao, I wanted to ask you, so we've been talking about the Benevolent Association in Kingston. You grew up in New York?
So I was born in London, and then migrated to New York. But yeah, mostly New York, New Jersey is where I've grown up.
And we usually ask our guests this question, but maybe we could do like a two-parter, is if you can tell us kind of like what your childhood was like, and whether you have a hot pot origin story.
I guess what my childhood was like, bustling in terms of New York, London being these two huge cities. I feel I have very warm feelings about the Chinatowns of both, even though the London Chinatown is very small. I feel at home when I'm there, even though I didn't go there when I was a child. In my research, having gone back to the UK, especially because there's so much colonial archival research to do there, I recognize so much there. And in terms of a very specific Cantonese culture, sometimes Hakka, and it's just very comforting. So I would say the same for New York City, or let's say Manhattan's Chinatown, because there's many Chinatowns across New York. And I actually have taught a class that I hope I get to teach again, called Chinatown, New York, Havana, Kingston. And in it, I was able to task my students with mapping these three Chinatown spaces And I think it was just an incredible way to think sensorially about where Chinatown begins and ends, and whether it's for tourists or not. And yeah, it's just really wonderful to be able to think about the architecture of these spaces that formed out of segregation, but you know, they're not just for tourists. So certainly whenever I visit London, I have to go to Chinatown. Whenever I visit any city that has a Chinatown, I have to go and see if I recognize certain things. And market spaces, Chinese shops, just there's a language that feels so familiar. So to the question of hot pot, I think I had it for the first time in Beijing, interestingly enough. And there was this waiter who like had these hand-pulled noodles that he was dancing with. I should have shared that video with you both, but it was mesmerizing. Also, like I was there with my mother and my sister, and it was our first time visiting Asia. Like we didn't know anyone there, and serendipitously we were able to find like family in Hong Kong. And then we ended up traveling to Shanghai and then to Beijing. But I just remember that first hot pot experience. And definitely like we could smell the hot pot many days later.
Oh my God.
Oh yeah. It like comes out of your pores.
But it was so sweet. Like these two older women, like we didn't know what we were doing, and they set it up for us. We didn't speak the language, of course. And I think food is just this language where you're able to learn and also have this kind of acrobatics of like dancing with the noodles. It was just incredible. So I've tried my hand at it, but yeah, it's pretty amazing to see that noodle dancing.
Have you tried the noodle the noodle pulling? Yeah,
I've done it. So made noodles from scratch, and I should have shared that video with you too. So I can only do it like this, but it's so much fun. Again, not Hakka food at all, but it's just been really fun to like try different foods across China and understand the regional specificity of what actually did make it to the Caribbean. And a lot of that to do with the Pearl River Delta. But yeah, it's just interesting when people talk about Chinese food that they don't always talk about that specificity of what region, how it's cooked, who, you know, all of these things that get taken for granted from a Western palate, at least. That's not Chinese.
Yeah. Cool.
Tao, I'm wondering what you're currently working on and what can we look forward to in the near future?
So always working on many, many things. I think I counted it and I just said yes to another talk today. So that brings me to 31 talks that I'm giving this semester.
Oh my gosh.
And I mean, the reason that I keep saying yes is that it's so much fun, and I'm so like honored that people want to engage with this work that I've been doing for so long, and that I live like as a person who is Afro-Chinese. So I'm excited that people are wanting to learn and to do so through music, through food. So tomorrow I'm giving a talk at NYU for their music department on music, and we'll be talking about that article that you referenced, Jen. And I guess two other food events that I have coming up are another one with the Museum of Food and Drink, and that's on April 8th. So that will be on Caribbean fried rice, and I'll be recounting my time in Cuba and yeah, you know, the benevolent associations there, the family associations, and it was such a welcoming community. People say that it's so small, the Chinatown there, but it was just the right size for me in terms of, again, feeling at home and recognizing different things. So I'll have a recipe for my take on Cuban Chinese fried rice for that April 8th. And then another food event that might be of interest is on May 20th with the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, in collaboration with the Museum of African Diaspora, also NSF or Northern California. I'll be cooking with my friend Andrea Chung, who is also Hakka, Jen.
Wow.
And we're gonna, just like cook together and talk about Hakka women, Afro-Chinese family, and see where that takes us. So she's gonna cook sugar because she's a visual artist who works with sugar, and like melting it and thinking about the plantation where Black and Asian people were working side by side in some situations. And then I'll be cooking plantains. So yeah, it's fun to be able to say yes to these fun sort of virtual events, really just hoping and dreaming for what can be possible once we're able to actually be in person again. So yeah, a lot going on with events. I'm working on my book called Black Capital, Chinese Debt, and just trying to get the work done.
David, I could see your face seething with envy. David and I joked that you're basically doing everything that David wants to be doing. He's also
I'm inspired by the hot pot talks, like that you can just like have these conversations and it like accumulates. So I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much, Tao. I can't believe it. An hour has flown by. I feel like we could have talked for much longer.
Well, yeah, we have some time for some last lingering words. If there's
Well, I'm curious about your work with Dark Laboratory. Can you tell us a bit about that? And
Sure. So I have the Afro-Asia group, which really attends to these questions of my personal research. But beyond like what I write about, I have started the Dark Laboratory, which is a collective that looks at the crossroads of Black and Indigenous life. And that started last year on Indigenous Peoples Day. And yeah, it's very much in formation, but we have tons of events coming up just this semester alone to do with people who are Black and Indigenous. So Black Indians, as they're referred to in the United States. Because again, I think as someone who's Afro-Chinese, I understand that Black and Chinese are not mutually exclusive categories of identification always. So I want to kind of just give a spotlight to the fact that Black Indigenous people exist and should be able to have a space to tell their story and perspective. But also that it's the foundation of the hemisphere, you know, the dispossession of Native sovereignty and entangled with African enslavement. So we've got a lot of different creative projects and a big event coming up on Earth Day, because we're really thinking about ecology as a way to understand justice for everyone, and really centering Black and Native forms of cultivation and knowledge in terms of taking care of the land and climate crisis. So yeah, I'm excited for future intersections as to how that ties into Asian identity as well, and things that you both have tipped me off to. So lots cooking over there in that laboratory space.
Amazing. Cool.
Are we good? Should we? Because I have one more question. I'm just so curious.
Yeah, go ahead.
I can't believe it's been an hour. It feels like 10 minutes.
Exactly. If you wouldn't mind, because of course you teach, and so a lot of the students are Gen Z, and I spend quite a chunk of time kind of researching on TikTok because I'm just fascinated by Gen Z culture and the ways in which they embody all of the things that, you know, what I grew up with are not as easily reconciled. And by that, I mean, like, when you identify with like dropout culture, underground culture, you don't necessarily see those things interconnect or overlap. But now everything crosses over, I think, with mainstream, if you will. I'm just curious if you have any insight that you may have observed working with students and other kind of like Gen Z students, and like what's up and coming, what's the struggle, what is it now?
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm gonna try not to age myself by telling you all of like the lingo that I learned from. I'm like, they're Gen Z or Gen Z? But I want to give a shout out to Ari, who, you know, for Afro-Asia Group, she's the director of communications, and I've just learned so much from her. You know, she was in the first iteration of the class that I teach called Afro-Asia. And yeah, it's just so beautiful to see her intellectual journey as part of this Gen Z, who is, you know, she's pursuing a PhD right now at University of Hawaii.
Wow.
And back to the question of the dark laboratory, but she's also involved. It has to, you know, start with the indigenous peoples of these lands that we're talking about. So I think, if anything, I've learned to, yeah, think about land acknowledgements, to think about sexuality in ways that is critical. In that I would teach this Afro-Asia class, which was called the Darker Nations. And most of my students were women or people who don't identify as men. And I think that the classroom space, whoever was signing up for this class when I taught it at NYU, was really beautiful, in that people ended up becoming best friends or like dating and meeting their girlfriend in the class. And a lot of, yeah, I think there was just a lot of openness and ways in which sexuality was always where we began in terms of Afro-Asia. So I renamed the class Afro-Asia Food, Futurism, and Feminisms, because I realized that feminisms, and especially third world feminisms and women of color solidarity, was critical to any kind of true reckoning with Afro-Asia. And I'll credit Ari for, yeah, just being a part of that journey. So I'm so proud of her, you know, engaging in this work, thinking critically about what it means to be in a space like Hawaii, and whether the term settler of color is even relevant. So we're just ready to have these important and difficult debates, and to understand that the history of Chinese in the Americas is not just one of voluntary labor. It doesn't start after 1965. There is a history of mutilation. There's a history of working on these plantations and of abuse, of being whipped and beaten by, you know, overseers. And we need to reckon with the deeper histories of anti-Asian violence in order to move forward towards any kind of decolonial future. It's going to take a reckoning with all of these different sedimented layers, and how race even becomes a kind of concept to order all of these different people. So yeah, it's messy and it's necessary, it's urgent. And for that reason, I think we need to eat good food and listen to good music to sustain ourselves, because the work is hard, but we're ready to do it in the Afro-Asia group. So I'm just really glad to have the help of Ari, as well as Sherry Chen, who is actually in China right now, is another former student who attends Cornell and is helping me out with the Afro-Asia group. So yeah, it's kind of like being a professor. You have a focus group that can tell you what's new, what the lingo is, and what to listen to and play at sets. So.
Wonderful. And on that note, thank you so much, Tao. Don't leave just yet. We look forward to seeing and talking to you very soon. Okay, David, let's announce our final and last Hot Pot Talk, which is next Wednesday. Same time, same place. The finale will just be me and David. Uncensored. So uncensored. We will be reflecting on the previous 8 guests, or eight Hot Pot Talks. I can't believe it's been 8 weeks.
Yeah, and I think also expanding upon some of the themes that we've been talking about. You know, Jen, there's actually, you know, we know each other very well, but there's also questions I have for you too. So.
Oh, okay. So we have to prep in advance questions for each other in much the same way we prep in advance before each guest comes on. Okay. Well,
Great.
thank you everybody for tuning in to this incredible Hakka Talk with Tao Leigh Goffe. I know that I have more questions than questions answered. And so I look forward to learning more. And David, I guess we'll just end it here.
Great. Thanks
Thanks
everyone.
everyone.
Have a good night.